Ask God to give you a biblical perspective of your spouse. Express your appreciation verbally to your spouse. I can hear some readers saying, "But what about my spouse's negative behavior? My attitude is not going to change that." Maybe not right away, but a positive attitude on your part will set in motion relational dynamics that create an atmosphere in which your spouse's behavior can change for the better. Simply stated, a positive attitude expressed in positive affirmations tends to create a positive response. The ice of winter begins to melt and the hope of spring is born. This is not deep psychology or profound theology. It is simply common sense. Choose a winning attitude and you are more likely to win. Tell yourself that you can be a better spouse and you will become one. Tell yourself that your spouse can make positive changes and he or she will. Tell yourself that, with God's help, you will see spring again and you are far more likely to see it. Choosing a winning attitude works in all 4 seasons of marriage. If your marriage is in winter, it can start you on the road to spring. In a fall marriage, choosing to focus on your spouse's positive qualities can reopen the lines of communication and keep your marriage from fading into winter. In a spring or summer marriage, adopting a positive attitude will result in a further blossoming of your relationship and will help to establish a warmer climate in your marriage. Another way to bring spring and summer to your marriage is described in Strategy 3. I was standing in a grocery store checkout line one day when I glanced at the magazine rack. Of the 20 different magazines displayed there, 17 had the word love at least once on the cover. Late one Saturday night, as I was driving home from the airport with my radio tuned to the local country station, there's nothing quite like country music to keep you awake when you are driving late at night. The DJ was playing 12 in a row without commercial interruption. Of the 12 songs, 10 focused on love. If you watch the daytime soaps or primetime TV or check the sales statistics on romance novels, you will have all the evidence you need that Western culture is obsessed with love. Yet, despite all the talk about love, the reality is that thousands of children go to bed every night feeling unloved by their parents, and thousands of husbands and wives go to bed feeling unloved by their spouse. Our culture is largely ignorant of the true nature of love and its effect on human relationships. Yet nothing holds more potential for changing the season of your marriage than learning the truth about love. Part of the problem is that we use the word love rather loosely. Listen to any conversation on the street and you're likely to hear statements like these: "I love hot dogs. I love the beach. I love my baby. I love the mountains. I just love my new sports car. I love my mother. I love my dog. I love the zoo." Is it any wonder, then, that when a husband says to his wife, "I love you, honey," she's not sure what to make of his statement? In this chapter I'm not going to challenge our society's casual use of the word love. Instead, I'm going to focus on the importance of love as an essential human need. Whether we're educated or uneducated, we know instinctively that children need to feel loved. I like to describe each child as having an emotional love tank. When the love tank is full, that is, when the child genuinely feels loved by the parents, the child grows up normal and well-adjusted. But when the love tank is empty, the child grows up with many internal struggles. During the teenage years, these children will go looking for love, typically in all the wrong places. Much misbehavior among children and teenagers stems from an empty love tank. The same is true of adults. Married or single, every adult has an emotional love tank. When we feel loved by people significant to us, life is beautiful. When our love tank is empty, we struggle emotionally. Much misbehavior among adults grows out of an empty love tank. For us married folks, the person we would most like to have love us is our spouse. If we feel loved by our spouse, the world looks bright. But if our love tank is empty, the world begins to look rather dark. Success in business, education, or sports will not satisfy the longing of the human heart for emotional love. When emotional love evaporates, marriages slip into fall and then winter. Conversely, when emotional love is rekindled, the warm breezes of spring and summer return to the marriage. In this chapter I want to focus on the nature of emotional love as it relates to marriage. What you are about to read has the potential to change the emotional climate of your marriage. It all begins with the tingles. In the normal course of life, we meet someone who catches our attention. There is something about the way he or she looks, talks, or acts that gives us a warm tingly feeling inside. The tingles are what motivate people to go out with each other. Sometimes, on the first date, we lose the tingles. We find out something intolerable about the other person and the tingles dissipate. But with some people, every time we get together, it just gets tinglier and tinglier. Eventually, we find ourselves emotionally obsessed. We're quite certain that he or she is the most wonderful person we've ever met. Everyone else will see the flaws, but we won't. Our parents may say, "Have you considered that he hasn't had a steady job in 5 years?" But we'll respond, "Give him a break. He's just waiting for the right opportunity." Our friends may ask, "Have you considered that she's been married 5 times before?" But we'll respond, "Those other guys were losers. The woman deserves to be happy, and I'm going to make her happy." This stage of a romantic relationship can best be described as emotional obsession. We can't get the other person off our minds. We go to bed thinking about him, and we wake up thinking about him. All day long, we wonder what she's doing. Talking with her is the highlight of our day, and we want to spend as much time with her as possible. This obsession leads to irrational thoughts such as, "I'll never be happy unless we are together forever. Nothing else in life really matters." In this stage of love, differences are minimized or denied. All we know is that we're happy, we've never been happier, and we intend to be happy for the rest of our lives. This euphoric stage of love does not require a lot of effort. We are swept along by a river of positive emotions. We are willing to do almost anything for the benefit of the other person. It is during this time of emotional obsession that most people get married. They anticipate that they will continue to have these euphoric feelings for each other forever. They fail to understand that emotional obsession is only the initial stage of romantic love. Research indicates that the average duration of this initial euphoria is 2 years. When we come down off the emotional high, we must make the transition to the next stage of love, which is much more intentional and requires a conscious effort to meet the emotional needs of the other person. Many couples fail to make this transition. Instead, they get the tingles for someone else, divorce, and remarry, repeating the cycle with another mate. 60% of those who remarry will experience a second divorce. And if perchance they try again, the divorce rate for third marriages is 75%. The importance of learning how to make the transition from the obsessive stage to the intentional stage of love should be obvious. Just because we stay in a relationship does not mean that emotional love will continue to flow. The second stage of love is truly different from the first. The obsessive feelings we had for each other begin to fade, and we recognize other important pursuits in life besides pursuing each other. The illusions of perfection evaporate, and the words of our parents and friends return to our minds. "He hasn't had a steady job in 5 years. She's been married 5 times before." We start to wonder how we could have been so blind to reality. Differences in personality, interests, and lifestyle now become obvious, whereas before we hardly noticed. The euphoria that led us to put each other first and to focus on each other's well-being has now dissipated, and we begin to focus on ourselves and to realize that our spouse is no longer meeting our needs. We begin to request and then demand things from our mate, and when he or she refuses to meet our demands, we withdraw or lash out in anger. Our anger or withdrawal pushes our mate further away and makes it more difficult for him or her to express love to us. Can such tarnished relationships be reborn? The answer is yes if couples become aware of the nature of love and learn how to express love in a language their mate can understand. Good intentions are not enough. We must also learn how to meet our spouse's emotional need for love. People are different. What makes one person feel loved will not necessarily make another person feel loved. By nature, we tend to express love to others in the way we wish they would express love to us. When our spouse doesn't respond positively to our expressions of love, we get frustrated. The problem is not the sincerity of our love, the problem is that we are speaking the wrong love language. If we speak our own love language but not our mate's, we will fail to communicate. I am often asked to explain the popularity of my book The 5 Love Languages, which has now sold more than 3 million copies and has been translated into 34 languages around the world. I believe that the book has been successful because it has helped people learn to make the transition from obsessive love to intentional love. It has taught people how to discover and speak their spouse's love language and thus keep emotional love alive in their relationship. In the remainder of this chapter, I want to give you a brief summary of the 5 love languages. Regardless of which season your marriage is now in, learning to speak your partner's love language will enhance your communication, fill your spouse's love tank, and strengthen your relationship. If your marriage is in fall or winter, learning to speak your spouse's love language may be the key to turning your marriage around and heading forward into spring and summer. The 5 love languages. After 30 years as a marriage counselor, I am convinced that there are 5 basic love languages, 5 ways to express love emotionally. Each person has a primary love language that we must learn to speak if we want a person to feel loved. Words of affirmation. One time when my wife and I were visiting our daughter and son-in-law and our 2 grandchildren, our son-in-law took the garbage out after dinner. When he walked back into the room where we were talking with our daughter, she looked up and said, "John, thanks for taking the garbage out." Inside I said, yes. Because I knew the power of appreciation. I can't tell you how many men and women have sat in my office over the past 30 years and said to me, "I work my tail off every day, yet my spouse acts like I haven't done a thing. I never get a single word of appreciation." If your spouse's primary love language is words of affirmation, your spoken praise and appreciation will fall like rain on parched soil. Before long, you will see new life sprouting in your marriage as your spouse responds to your words of love. Acts of service. Do you remember the old saying, "Actions speak louder than words"? For some people, that is particularly true of love. If acts of service is your spouse's primary love language, nothing will speak more deeply to him or her emotionally than simple acts of service. Maxine, who had been married for 15 years, came to my office one day because she was frustrated with her marriage. Listen to what she said. "I don't understand David. Every day he tells me that he loves me, but he never does anything to help me. He just sits on the couch watching TV while I wash the dishes, and the thought never crosses his mind to help me. I'm sick of hearing "I love you." If he loved me, he would do something to help me. Maxine's primary love language is acts of service, not words of affirmation, and even though her husband, David, loved her, he had never learned to express his love in a way that made her feel loved. However, after David and I talked and he read the 5 love languages, he got the picture and started speaking Maxine's love language. In less than a month, her love tank was beginning to fill up, and their marriage moved from winter to spring. The next time I talked to Maxine, she said, "It's wonderful. I wish we had come for counseling 10 years ago. I never knew about the love languages. I just knew I didn't feel loved." Receiving gifts. In every society throughout human history, gift-giving has been perceived as an expression of love. Giving gifts is universal, because there is something inside the human psyche that says if you love someone, you will give to him or her. What many people do not understand is that for some people, receiving gifts is their primary love language. It's the thing that makes them feel loved most deeply. If you're married to someone whose primary love language is gift-giving, you will make your spouse feel loved and treasured by giving gifts on birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and, no occasion, days. The gifts need not be expensive or elaborate, it's the thought that counts. Even something as simple as a homemade card or a few cheerful flowers will communicate your love to your spouse. Little things mean a lot to a person whose primary love language is receiving gifts. Quality time. If your spouse's love language is quality time, giving him or her your undivided attention is one of the best ways you can show your love. Some men pride themselves on being able to watch television, read a magazine, and listen to their wives, all at the same time. That is an admirable trait, but it is not speaking the love language of quality time. Instead, you must turn off the TV, lay the magazine down, look into your mate's eyes, and listen and interact. To your spouse, 20 minutes of your undivided attention listening and conversing is like a 20-minute refill of his or her love tank. Men, if you really want to impress your wife, the next time she walks into the room while you are watching a sporting event, put the television on mute and don't take your eyes off her as long as she's in the room. If she engages you in conversation, turn the TV off and give her your undivided attention. You will score 1,000 points and her love tank will be overflowing. Physical touch. We have long known the emotional power of physical touch. That's why we pick up babies and touch them tenderly. Long before an infant understands the meaning of the word love, he or she feels loved by physical touch. In marriage, the love language of physical touch includes everything from putting a hand on your mate's shoulder as you walk by, touching his or her leg as you're driving together, and holding hands while you're walking to kissing, embracing, and sexual intercourse. If physical touch is your spouse's primary love language, nothing communicates love more clearly than for you to take the initiative to reach out and touch your mate. Discovering your spouse's love language. If the key to meeting your spouse's need for emotional love is learning to speak his or her love language, how can you discover what that love language is? It's simple. Listen to your spouse's complaints. Here are 5 common complaints and the love language that each reveals. You mean you didn't bring me anything? Did you even miss me while you were gone? Receiving gifts. We never spend any time with each other anymore. We're like 2 ships passing in the dark. Quality time. I don't think you would ever touch me if I didn't initiate it. Physical touch. I can't do anything right around here. All you ever do is criticize. I can never please you. Words of affirmation. If you loved me, you would do something around here. You never lift a finger to help. Acts of service. Typically, when our spouse complains, we get irritated. But he or she is actually giving us valuable information. Complaints often reveal the key to our spouse's inner longing for emotional love. If we learn our mate's primary love language and speak it, we will have a happier spouse and a better marriage. But what if your spouse's primary love language is something that isn't easy for you to do? What if you're not a touchy-feely person but your spouse's primary love language is physical touch? The answer is simple, though not necessarily easy. You learn to speak the language of physical touch. You learn to speak a new love language by trying. At first it might be very difficult, but the second time will be easier, and the third time even easier. Eventually, you can become proficient in speaking your mate's love language, and if he or she reciprocates by speaking your language, the two of you will keep emotional love alive in your marriage forever. My files are filled with letters from people who tell me that learning their spouse's primary love language revolutionized their marriage. For example, Rick, a 33-year-old truck driver who has been married for 12 years, wrote, "We have the best marriage we've ever had. My wife purchased the 5 love languages on audio tape for me so I could listen in my tractor trailer. We were in a winter season at this stage in our marriage. After I discovered her love language, it helped me to understand why she had been saying that I didn't love her. I knew I loved her, and I told her all the time. The problem was that her love language is acts of service, and I never did anything to help her around the house. I guess I followed my dad's example, but then mom and dad never had a very good marriage, either. Now I try to do things for Brenda when I'm home. It has made a great difference in our marriage." Rick's wife, Brenda, wrote, "We were having serious problems and were talking about separating. I had a friend who let me read her copy of the 5 love languages. Then Rick and I started talking about our relationship. I learned that his love language is words of affirmation. Here I had been criticizing him because I didn't feel loved by him, but all along I was only making him feel worse and didn't know it. Now he speaks my language and I speak his. We went from a very wintry season to a warm spring or summer season." Understanding your spouse's primary love language and learning to speak it can make a world of difference in your marriage. What if your spouse is unwilling to read a book about marriage or discuss your marriage? With marriages in the fall and winter seasons, this is often the case. One spouse becomes concerned enough about the marriage to read a book, attend a seminar, or go for counseling, while the other spouse is unwilling to do anything. This is when unconditional love becomes exceedingly important. It is easy to love your spouse when your spouse is loving you. It is easy to say kind words to your spouse when he or she is treating you kindly. But even if your spouse is unwilling to try or to reciprocate, unconditional love means that you will choose to love your spouse in his or her primary love language. Although unconditional love is difficult, it is the kind of love that God has for us. Romans 5:8 says that God loved us, while we were still sinners, and sent Christ to die for us. Scripture also says that we love God, because He first loved us, 1 John 4:19. Therefore, when you choose to love your spouse unconditionally, you are following God's example. And if you ask God, He will give you the ability to do it. In Romans 5:5 the Apostle Paul says, God has poured out His love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. Likewise, when you pour out your love by speaking your spouse's love language, you are doing the most emotionally powerful thing you can do. Your spouse desperately needs emotional love from you. As your spouse's love tank begins to fill, there is a good chance that he or she will begin to reciprocate. A full love tank creates a positive atmosphere in which you and your spouse can talk about your differences more easily and negotiate solutions to your conflicts. I have seen many hard, cold men and women melt when they begin to receive love in their love language. Love is the most powerful weapon in the world for good. It can thaw the coldest of winters and bring the blossoms of spring to your marriage. The ability to speak and the ability to listen are two of the more profound gifts that God has given to humanity. Animals don't sit around the campfire reminiscing about what happened 5 years ago or discussing what they hope will happen in the future. But people do. Oral communication is the foundation of all human culture. These abilities to speak and to listen allow us to pass ideas from one mind to another. Likewise, in a marriage nothing is more fundamental than talking and listening. This simple transaction is the vehicle that allows couples to process life together as teammates. Open communication is the lifeblood that keeps a marriage in the spring and summer seasons. Conversely, failure to communicate is what brings on fall and winter. Speaking and listening, it sounds so simple. So why is it that when divorced individuals were asked in a survey, "Why did your marriage fail?" 87% said, "Deficient communication." Could these marriages have been redeemed and restored? I believe the answer is yes if the couples had learned some positive communication patterns. The key to improving communication with one's spouse lies in developing the power of empathetic listening. Empathy means to enter into another person's world, to seek to walk in his or her shoes and see the world from his or her perspective. An empathetic husband seeks to understand what his wife is experiencing, her thoughts, feelings, and desires. And the same is true of an empathetic wife toward her husband. She seeks to understand his dreams, his hopes, his fears. Empathetic listening encourages other people to talk, because they know they will be heard. Unfortunately, by nature we tend to be judgmental listeners. We evaluate what the other person says based on our own view of the situation, and we respond by pronouncing our judgment. Judgmental listening tends to stop the flow of communication and we wonder why our spouse doesn't talk more. By failing at the art of empathetic listening, we sabotage intimacy, the very thing we so desperately want. The goal of this chapter is to help you learn how to promote positive communication by means of empathetic listening. This may require a radical change in the way you converse with your spouse. It will certainly take effort and practice, but the rewards will be overwhelmingly positive. For most of us, empathetic listening requires a significant change of attitude. We must shift from egocentric listening, viewing the conversation through our own eyes, to empathetic listening, viewing the conversation through our spouse's eyes. The goal of empathetic listening is to see the world from your spouse's perspective and thus understand what he or she is experiencing inside both perceptions and feelings. This is important. You will never understand your spouse if you limit your listening to perceptions, thoughts, opinions, and desires. You must also understand the feelings that lie behind the thoughts. The husband who says, "I think I'll just stop going to church," and the wife who responds, "Why would you do that?" That's not going to help anything. Have had a brief dialogue, but little understanding. On the other hand, if the wife responds, "What makes you say that?" and the husband says, "I just get so discouraged hearing the same old condemning sermons every Sunday," they are now on the road to understanding. If they continue this process of empathetic listening, they may well come to understand each other. Perhaps you're thinking, "I would be happy to listen to my spouse and to try to understand, if only he or she would say something." If your spouse is non-communicative, I can guarantee there's a reason or reasons for the silence. Perhaps your husband was not encouraged to talk as a child. Maybe his ideas were discounted or ignored by his parents until he developed the attitude, "Why talk? No one's listening." Maybe your wife has tried to communicate her thoughts and opinions but has felt put down or condemned. Thus, she reasons, "Who wants to be rejected? It's easier just to keep my mouth shut." On the other hand, it may simply be a matter of personality. In my counseling practice, I have identified two distinct personality types when it comes to talking: Dead Sea people and babbling brooks. With a Dead Sea personality, information flows in, but nothing ever comes back out. Just like the Dead Sea in Israel, which has no outlet but only receives and stores water from the Jordan River, Dead Sea personalities receive thoughts, feelings, and experiences throughout the day and they are perfectly content not to talk about them. If you ask these people, "What's wrong? Why aren't you talking?" their typical response will be, "Nothing's wrong. What makes you think something's wrong? To a Dead Sea personality, it is perfectly natural not to talk. The contrasting personality type is the babbling brook. Whatever they see or hear, they talk about. If no one is home to listen, they will call someone on the telephone and say, "Do you know what I just saw? Do you know what I just heard?" They have no reservoir. Usually these two personalities marry each other. Babbling brooks are attracted to dead seas because they are such wonderful listeners. Dead seas are comfortable with babbling brooks because they are not pressured to talk. The good news is that a dead sea can learn to talk and a babbling brook can learn to slow the flow. Effective communication is a choice. Empathetic listening will encourage a Dead Sea spouse to talk because it creates an atmosphere of genuine interest in what he or she is saying. If negative feelings have developed because of past treatment in childhood or in the marriage, empathetic listening tends to bring healing. In fact, the quickest way to deal constructively with negative feelings is to make the person feel heard and understood. Another question I am commonly asked is, how can I listen empathetically when my spouse's words are critical and harsh? Again, the answer lies in understanding what is behind the harsh, critical words. Typically, a spouse who speaks critically speaks out of a heart filled with hurt and anger from past mistreatment. We're all human, and we tend to get defensive when our self-esteem is threatened. But because empathetic listening incorporates both feelings and perceptions, it is the most effective means of helping people to process their hurt and anger, which is why it is one of the primary skills of an effective counselor. I am not suggesting that you become a counselor to your spouse. But I am suggesting that if you learn the art of empathetic listening, you can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Empathetic listening is also an effective vehicle for building your mate's self-esteem. When your spouse has a healthy self-esteem, he or she will be less defensive. Even if your spouse has some dysfunctional patterns of communication, empathetic listening can potentially create a climate where those patterns can be discovered and changed. Judgmental listening, on the other hand, simply perpetuates the problem. That's why many couples come to the point of saying, "We simply can't communicate, so why try?" Fall turns to winter, and winter often ends in divorce. I repeat my conviction that many of these divorces could have been averted if at least one of the spouses had learned the awesome power of empathetic listening. Learning to listen empathetically. Empathetic listeners approach every conversation with the attitude of trying to understand the other person. I want to know what is going on in my spouse's mind and heart. I want to enter into his or her joys and sorrows. Such levels of understanding are essential if you want to have an intimate marriage. One of the characteristics of empathetic listening is developing a genuine attitude of understanding. This is no small matter, nor will it be easy for most of us. Psychologist Paul Tournier expressed it well when he said, "Each one speaks primarily in order to set forth his own ideas." Exceedingly few exchanges of viewpoints manifest a real desire to understand the other person. By nature we are all egocentric. The world revolves around me. The way I think and feel is the most important issue. It is a giant step in maturity when we choose to develop an attitude of empathy, honestly seeking to understand the thoughts and feelings of another person. The Apostle Peter challenges men in particular when he writes to husbands, "Be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect." 1 Peter 3:7. According to Proverbs 18:2, egocentric living is foolish. A fool finds no pleasure in understanding but delights in airing his own opinions. Thus, when we ask God to help us change our attitudes, to give us a genuine desire to understand our spouse, we are showing signs of wisdom. Another important aspect of empathetic listening is choosing to withhold judgment on our spouse's ideas. Here again we may need to radically shift our way of thinking. After all, we have opinions on just about everything, and we're convinced that our perspective is accurate. Otherwise, we'd change our views, right? But when we say, "The way I see the situation is the way it is," we fail to recognize that our spouse thinks the same thing about his or her own opinions. Because we are both egocentric, we often have differing opinions about the same situation. That is simply part of being human and being married. Spouses often see things very differently. If I listen to my wife with a view to setting her straight, I will never understand her, and most of our conversations will end in arguments with no resolution, leaving us as enemies rather than friends, opponents rather than teammates. It is this propensity to pass judgment that daily sabotages the conversations of thousands of couples. When a wife says, "I think I am going to have to quit my job," and the husband responds, "You can't quit your job. We can't make it without your salary. And remember, you're the one who wanted this house," they are either on the road to an intense argument or else they will withdraw and suffer in silence, each blaming the other for the coldness of winter that settles on their marriage. But how very different the conversation would be if the husband withheld judgment and instead responded to his wife by saying, "It sounds like you had a hard day at work, honey. Do you want to talk about it?" He has now opened up the possibility of understanding his wife. And when she feels understood, together they can make a wise decision regarding her job. It is the withholding of judgment that allows the conversation to proceed. A third characteristic of empathetic listening is the most important but also the most difficult. Affirm your spouse even when you disagree with his or her ideas. How do you do this? By affirming your spouse for sharing his or her ideas and feelings with you. In other words, you express your appreciation to your spouse for being open and honest with you. Affirmation is a big step beyond merely withholding judgment. When you affirm your spouse verbally, you give him or her the freedom to have ideas that differ from your own and to have feelings that you would not have in a similar situation. Your affirmation might be verbalized in statements similar to these: "I appreciate that you are sharing your ideas and feelings with me. Now I can understand why you could feel so hurt. If I were in your shoes, I'm sure I would feel the same way. I want you to know that I love you very much, and it hurts me to see you hurting, but at least now I understand what's going on inside you. And I appreciate your being open with me. Obviously all of this affects me, and I have some thoughts and feelings about it. I'm not sure I can verbalize them, but I would be willing to try whenever you want to hear them. But please know that I am with you. I love you, and I want to do whatever I can to help." A partner who hears these affirming words may or may not be ready immediately to receive the spouse's perspective. But he or she will feel understood and affirmed. Nothing is more important than affirmation to create an atmosphere in which one spouse will eventually be willing to hear the other's perspective. Developing the art of affirmation, whether you agree or disagree with your spouse's ideas, creates a positive climate that encourages your mate to share openly, and it cultivates the soil in which the seeds of teamwork can be planted. Eventually, those seeds will blossom into the flowers of spring and summer. The capstone of empathetic listening is that you share your own ideas only when your spouse feels understood. As with the other steps, this one may require a monumental change in our typical communication patterns. By nature, we are quick to give our ideas. In fact, one research project indicates that the average person listens for 17 seconds before interrupting to give his or her own ideas on the subject. That is egocentric listening at its worst and seldom results in productive conversation. Empathetic listening, on the other hand, creates a positive climate in which your spouse will almost certainly want to hear what you have to say. When your mate feels understood rather than condemned, he or she will be far more open to hearing your point of view. Empathetic listening stimulates positive feelings. The most common mistake in most marital conversations is the premature expression of ideas. Such behavior almost always ends in unproductive arguments that leave the couple more estranged and the marriage that much closer to winter. The 4 keys of empathetic listening: listen with an attitude of understanding, not judgment. Withhold judgment on your spouse's ideas. Affirm your spouse, even when you disagree with his or her ideas. Share your own ideas only when your spouse feels understood. Marissa came to my marriage seminar alone. She described her marriage in the following way: "Our marriage is no fun. We are definitely in the winter season. I don't want to go home at night and deal with my husband. I want things to change. I know that we both must change. I tend to shut him out. I don't talk to him. When we try talking, we argue about everything. I don't listen to him, and he doesn't listen to me. I talked to him on the phone last night after our session, and he is open to reading a book with me. I hope that our marriage can get better." I had the sense that if Marissa could learn the skills of empathetic listening, she could turn her marriage toward spring. What are the practical skills that can help Marissa and you develop the art of empathetic listening? Learning the skills of empathetic listening. The ideas I am going to share are not mysterious. They are not wrapped in psychological terms. But even though they are easy to understand, mastering them will take conscious effort and practice. I believe that anyone who sincerely tries can learn the awesome power of empathetic listening. I suggest that you read the following list of ideas again and again until they become a part of your thinking. When your spouse starts talking to you, ask God to help you remember and apply the skills that will be most meaningful to your spouse. Daily pray the prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi, who prayed, "O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand." That is a prayer that God will answer. Put the following steps into practice and you will have to practice. And watch your communication blossom. Listen with your eyes. Give your spouse your undivided attention. Turn off the TV. Put down the book or magazine and look at your spouse. Eye contact communicates, what you are saying is important to me. Listen with your mouth. Keep it closed for at least 5 minutes. Interjecting your ideas too soon indicates that you are not in an empathetic listening mode. As long as your spouse is talking, your role is to listen. Remember, your goal is to find out what is going on in your spouse's mind and heart. Listen with your neck. Nodding your head indicates, I'm trying to understand what you are saying. I'm with you. Registered listen with your hands. Don't fidget with a pencil, paper, or the TV remote control. Let your hands relax at your sides or on your legs. Don't put them behind your neck or stretch to the ceiling as if you are bored. Behind your neck or stretch to the ceiling as if you are bored. Listen with your back. Lean forward occasionally while your spouse is talking, rather than sitting rigidly. A slight forward movement of the body communicates, you have my full attention. Copyright listen with your feet. Stay put. Don't walk out of the room while your spouse is talking unless, of course, an emergency erupts in the next room. If that happens, tell your spouse why you are leaving. For example, honey, let me put out this fire in the kitchen and I'll be right back. Listen for feelings as well as for facts. If you only listen and respond to what your spouse says and ignore feeling, she or she will not feel understood. Registered as you listen, try to see the situation from your spouse's perspective. Try to understand your spouse's interpretation of the situation and his or her feelings about what has happened. This is difficult to do, because we humans are naturally egocentric, but it is essential if you are to become an empathetic listener. Resist the urge to share your perspective before your spouse feels understood. Don't tell your spouse that he or she doesn't have the facts straight, is misunderstanding your intentions, or has no right to feel angry or disappointed. Never share your perspective until you understand your spouse's perspective. Once your mate feels understood, he or she will be far more likely, and far better able, to listen to your opinion. L0 Seek to clarify your understanding of your spouse's ideas by asking reflective questions. What I hear you saying is that you think. Am I understanding you correctly? When your spouse responds to your question, nod affirmingly. Don't jump into battle mode, even if you disagree with what your spouse is saying. Seek to clarify your understanding of your spouse's emotions by asking reflective questions. It seems to me that you are feeling disappointed because. Is that correct? Your spouse may agree or may say, because. Is that correct? Your spouse may agree or may say, disappointed. How about hurt, angry, and frustrated? Again, an affirming nod from you will communicate, I'm hearing you. 12. Summarize your understanding of your mate's thoughts and feelings. What I am understanding you to say is that you are hurt and angry because you feel that I let you down by not. Is that correct? When your spouse indicates that you understand what he or she is thinking and feeling, you are now ready for the most important step in empathetic listening, affirmation. 13. Affirm your spouse's thoughts and feelings verbally. You might say something like this: as I listen to you, I can see how you would feel hurt and angry at me. If I were in your shoes, I'm sure I would feel the same way. And you would if you were truly seeing the situation from your spouse's perspective. Verbal affirmation of your spouse's thoughts and feelings is what makes you an understanding mate rather than an enemy. 14. Request permission to share your perspective. Now that you have fully heard your spouse and understand his or her thoughts and feelings, you are ready to ask permission to share your own perspective. You might say something like this: I really appreciate your sharing with me. Now I understand why you would be upset, or whatever emotion you sense he or she is feeling. Can I share with you my perspective, because I think it will let you know what was going on inside me through all this. If your spouse is open, and people typically are open after they feel understood, you are now free to share your perspective of what you did and why you did it. By listening empathetically to your spouse, you create an atmosphere in which your spouse is more likely to listen empathetically to you. When two people are seeking to understand each other, usually they will. Then they can seek a solution to their problem. When they seek to resolve rather than win an argument, they not only discover workable solutions but also find intimacy with their spouse. Few things are more important in moving a marriage from fall or winter back to spring or summer than the awesome power of empathetic listening. What is success? Ask a dozen people and you may get a dozen different answers. A friend of mine said, "Success is making the most of who you are with what you've got." I like that definition. Every person has the potential to make a positive impact on the world. It all depends on what we do with what we have. Success is measured not by the amount of money we possess or the position we attain but by how we use our resources and our opportunities. Position and money can be used to help others, or they can be squandered or abused. The truly successful people are those who help others succeed. The same is true in marriage. A successful wife is one who expends her time and energy helping her husband reach his potential for God and for doing good in the world. Likewise, a successful husband is one who helps his wife succeed. An old adage says, "You can't help a man uphill without getting closer to the top yourself." I agree with my friend Harold Sala, who said, "With the possible exception of the parents who give a son guidance in the early years of his life, no single person contributes to the success of a man more than his wife." It could also be said that a husband makes the greatest contribution to his wife's success or failure. I must confess that I knew very little about helping my wife succeed in the early days of our marriage. I suppose that in a general sense I wanted her to be happy and successful. But the main focus of my attention was on what she could do for me. When she did not live up to my expectations, I sought to motivate her by manipulation. My theme was, "I would treat you better if you would treat me better." It took me several years to discover the joy of helping Carolyn succeed, but when I did, our marriage went from winter to spring in a few short weeks. So, how does one get started? For me, it began with a fresh examination of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Few people would deny that Jesus has had the most positive impact on human history of any man who ever lived. Yet his approach was not manipulative or self-serving. In fact, quite the contrary, he led by serving others. During the 3.5 years of his public life, he healed the sick, fed the hungry, spoke with kindness to the downtrodden, and brought hope to the destitute. The Apostle Peter summarized the life of Jesus with this statement: "He went around doing good." Perhaps Jesus' greatest act of service apart from his sacrificial death on our behalf was when he took a basin of water and a towel and performed the lowly task of washing his disciples' feet. With that simple yet profound act of service, doing what needed to be done but what no one else wanted to do, Jesus demonstrated humility, love, and true leadership. Husbands, are you willing to humble yourself to such a degree to serve your wife? Wives, are you willing to serve your husband in such a way? Jesus removed all doubt about his intentions when he said, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." On another occasion Jesus told his followers, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." It's a great paradox the way up is down. True greatness is expressed through serving, not by seeking one's own agenda. This principle is true in marriage as well as in all of life. A truly great husband is one who is willing to serve his wife. A truly great wife is one who is willing to serve her husband. If you want to breathe new life into a fall or winter marriage, start serving your spouse. If your marriage is in spring or summer and you want to keep it there, start serving your spouse. Mowing the grass, cooking meals, cleaning the bathroom, vacuuming floors, doing the laundry, taking care of the kids while your spouse goes to the gym, washing the car, trimming the shrubs, helping with a computer problem, and cleaning out the garage are all examples of acts of service. It took me a long time to figure out that life's greatest meaning is found in giving, not in getting. When I finally grasped this profound principle, it made a significant difference in my marriage. For me, this attitude of service required an acute change of heart. My egocentric spirit had to be released, not to my wife but to God. I remember the day I prayed a simple prayer: "Lord, give me the attitude of Christ. I want to serve my wife as Jesus served his followers." As I look back on 4 decades of marriage, I'm convinced that God's answer to that prayer had a greater impact on my marriage than any prayer I have ever prayed. Once your heart attitude is changed, it is simply a matter of learning how to express service in ways that will help your spouse reach his or her potential for good. 3 simple case tie-ons made this practical for me. When I was willing to ask Carolyn these 3 questions and do what she suggested, I was on the road to helping her become successful. The questions are: 1. What can I do to help you? 2. How can I make your life easier? And 3. How can I be a better husband? My wife's responses to these 3 questions gave me the agenda that changed our marriage forever. 3 simple questions to help your spouse succeed. 1. What can I do to help you? 2. How can I make your life easier? 3. How can I be a better husband, wife? If you are in the winter season of marriage and are afraid that if you ask those questions, your spouse will simply say, "It's too late." I don't want to hear that. Let me suggest a different approach. Reflect on the complaints your spouse has made during your marriage. Those complaints reveal his or her hidden desires. You may have found them annoying at the time, but now that you have an attitude of service, they give you valuable information. Simply begin doing and saying the things your spouse has requested through the years, and you may well see a softening in his or her attitude. Ultimately, it is difficult to reject a husband or wife who is sincerely trying to help you succeed. Many couples have shared with me their experience in discovering this strategy. I met Phil in Birmingham, Alabama. He was 37 and had been married to his second wife for 2 years. He said, "We have gone from fall to spring. I have had to learn to change things about myself that will make our marriage better. I have to continually discover what's important to my wife and try to give it to her. I'm transitioning into more communication, which is hard for me. I had put sports and tailgating with friends over her for a period of time. I also didn't talk to her at all, and instead I shared things with others that should have been kept between the 2 of us. When I started spending quality time with her and started doing things that mattered to her, her attitude changed." Darlene, whom I met in Denver, was 48 and had been married to Rod for 30 years. "One major thing that made a difference," she said, "was that I began to understand more about my husband's needs. I was in "mother mode, most of the time and tended to forget that I was a wife, too, and that my husband needed me as much as my children did. I now realize that he is the one I will be spending my whole life with, not our children or our parents." Understanding the 5 love languages was so exciting to me and helped open me up to things my husband needs. I am continuing to learn to speak words of affirmation, which I know he needs. My husband has learned that I need him to spend more time with me and I need his help in doing things for me. He has learned how to talk with me more. With his compliments and patience, I have become a much happier person. We have definitely moved from winter to spring in our marriage. Darlene and Rod have discovered the joy of helping each other succeed. What are some practical ways you could help your spouse succeed? The best answer to that question will come from him or her, but let me share with you some of the things that other couples have found to be extremely helpful. One of the most effective ways to help your spouse is to offer encouraging words. The word encourage means to inspire, courage. All of us have areas in which we feel insecure and lack courage, and that lack of courage often hinders us from accomplishing the positive things that we would like to do. The latent potential within your spouse may await your encouraging words. A couple who were being interviewed on the occasion of their 50th wedding anniversary were asked, "To what do you attribute the success of your long marriage?" The husband responded, "Sarah was the first young lady I ever dated. When I proposed to her, I was scared stiff. But after the wedding, her dad took me aside and handed me a little package and said, "Here is all you really need to know." The obvious question was, and what was in that package? Reaching into his pocket, the man pulled out a gold watch and said, "This is it." There across the face of the watch, where he could see it a dozen times a day, was written, "Say something nice to Sarah." That, he said, is the key to our marriage. Life can sometimes be difficult, but when we receive positive words, we are encouraged to continue pursuing our dreams. When a man fails to get a promotion at work, he may feel that he is a failure. But when his wife says, "You're still number 1 in my book," he has the courage to work through his disappointment and continue. I was speaking at a church in Spokane, Washington, when I first heard Julia sing. After the service, I commended her for the excellent way she sang. I'll have to give my husband credit for that, she said. How's that? I asked. 6 years ago, I expressed the desire to take voice lessons. It's something I have always wanted to do. We had been married 4 years and had 2 preschool children. When I shared the idea with my husband, he said, "Go for it. I'll be glad to keep the children. You have such a beautiful voice, you need to develop the talent God has given you." "That's quite a husband you have," I said. "He's the absolute greatest," Julia responded. Perhaps your spouse has untapped potential in one or more areas of life. That potential may be awaiting your encouraging words. Perhaps your wife needs to enroll in a course to develop her potential. Maybe your husband needs to meet some people who have succeeded in his area of interest who can give him insight on the next step to take. Your words may supply the necessary courage to take that first step. Most of us have more potential than we will ever develop. What holds us back is often lack of courage. A loving spouse can supply that all-important catalyst. Julia's husband not only gave her encouraging words, he also took supportive action, which is a second way of helping your spouse to succeed. He was not only willing to keep the children once a week while Julia took voice lessons, he was also willing to use the family finances to help her accomplish her dream. One of the most common complaints I have encountered in my counseling office has been the husbands and wives who say, "My spouse is not supportive." They sometimes add, "I feel like she works against me rather than for me." Now, I must admit that sometimes this lack of support is another way of saying, "My spouse will not go along with all my crazy ideas." There are people who are dreamers but never attach their dreams to reality. They jump into a business venture and lose thousands of dollars, then can't understand why their spouse is not ready to jump into the next venture with them. There are, however, ways of being supportive even if your mate is an unrealistic dreamer. I'm not suggesting that you blindly support your spouse in an endeavor that you think is destined for failure. However, you might say something like this: "More than anything, I want to see you succeed in life. I'm encouraged that you have dreams. At the same time, I don't want to see you fail again. Therefore, I'm going to be very supportive of you in this idea, but I'm going to request that you talk with a banker or someone who could give you good information about this venture before you jump into it. I know that if you continue to try business ventures that fail, you will eventually get discouraged. I don't want that to happen. I want you to succeed, so let's get all the wisdom we can up front. Then let's jump together or let's decide not to jump at all." In such a statement, you are expressing your desire to be supportive in the most responsible manner. Often supportive actions spell the difference between success and failure. When your wife expresses a desire to join a weight loss program, don't say what one husband said, "We can't afford that. Why don't you just stop eating?" Such a non-supportive attitude not only sabotaged her dream but also the marriage. Helping your spouse succeed requires time, energy, effort, and perhaps sacrifice on your part. I am forever indebted to my wife for supporting me when I went back to graduate school. She took care of our young daughter while I worked part-time and went to school. We lived on a shoestring. For 3 years, she never bought a pair of shoes or a new dress for herself. Her sacrificial actions made it possible for me to complete graduate school. I would like to think that whatever success I have experienced brings her a great deal of satisfaction, knowing that she is largely responsible for my successes. By the way, she now has plenty of shoes and dresses. What desires has your spouse expressed? What supportive actions would it require on your part to see those dreams become realities? Why not express your willingness to support your spouse, both with encouragement and with supportive action? Few things give greater joy than seeing your spouse reach his or her potential for God and for good. 4 practical ways to help your spouse succeed. 1. Offer encouraging words. 2. Tall less than supportive action. 3. Provide emotional support. 4. Express respect for your spouse. I recently met a husband whose wife is a public speaker. He said, "I gave up my job so I could travel with her. I take care of her books and tapes and luggage. My greatest joy is in seeing her do what she enjoys most. I feel that by serving her, I am serving God." Here is a husband who has discovered the joy of helping his spouse succeed. A third practical way to help your spouse succeed is by giving emotional support. Emotions, positive and negative, are gifts from God. How dull life would be if we were not able to feel. Try to imagine watching a sunset, a ball game, or the ocean and feeling no emotion. We would be something less than human if we had no feelings. We are made in the image of God, and part of what that means is that we are emotional creatures. Unlike thoughts, which ideally we can control, our emotions are not nearly as manageable. Feelings are unsolicited, interior, personal reactions to what goes on around us or to what has happened to us in the past. Feelings are as common as breathing, yet many people talk about feelings as enemies. We sometimes hear people say such things as, "My emotions are about to destroy me." Why do we pit ourselves against our emotions? One reason is that we have seen so many other people who have followed their emotions and reaped destruction. They have done what they felt like doing and everyone around them suffered. Another reason we don't trust our feelings is that we know they change. They lift us up, and they let us down. Our highs don't last, and our lows seem to drag on forever. We conclude, therefore, that emotions are unreliable and that we must live independent of them if we are to have success. Perhaps the chief reason we consider emotions our enemies is that negative emotions don't seem to fit in with being a joyful Christian. Anger, fear, disappointment, loneliness, frustration, depression, and sorrow don't fit the stereotype of successful Christian living. But have you considered that Jesus, as a man, experienced every human emotion, even the negative ones? Does that mean that Jesus was not a success? Hardly. Emotions are not intrinsically good or bad, feelings are morally neutral. It is what we do in response to our feelings that characterizes them as bad or good, sinful or righteous. In response to anger, Jesus cleared the temple in Jerusalem of money changers and livestock, a very righteous act born out of his anger at sin. Negative and positive emotions are intended by God to be motivational instruments that move us in a positive direction. Whatever emotions we experience are good if they move us in the right direction. The emotions themselves are neutral, it is the results that will be positive or negative. Many Christians tend to deny their negative emotions. Said another way, many Christians are not willing to accept the fact that they have negative feelings. Others try to push their negative emotions onto the back burner and disregard them. It is far more productive to identify and accept our feelings and then to seek constructive ways of responding. Feelings are like thermometers. They report whether we are hot or cold, whether all is well or not so well. If all is well, then we can celebrate. If emotions indicate that all is not well, we can take positive action to correct the situation. Giving emotional support to your spouse begins by allowing positive and negative emotions. It means celebrating the positive emotions and affirming the negative emotions. To use the biblical phrase, it is rejoicing with those who rejoice and weeping with those who weep. Because of personality differences, we sometimes find this difficult. I remember the woman who said to me in the counseling office, "I don't understand my husband. Our baby has been sick for the last 3 months. My mother is battling cancer. The future of his job is uncertain. Yet he comes home excited that he got a 50 cents an hour pay raise." Because of her personality, her bent toward focusing on the negative, she had a hard time rejoicing with her husband over his small success. Instead, she said to him, "What good is that if you lose your job in 3 weeks?" He lashed out at her for being so negative and then left the room and remained silent for the rest of the evening. How different things might have been had she been emotionally supportive by saying something like, "Honey, that's great. That must mean they like the way you do your job. I'm so proud of you, no matter what happens in the future." By celebrating his small success, she would motivate him to pursue larger successes. By being emotionally supportive, she would be helping her husband succeed. When your spouse has negative emotions such as anger, disappointment, depression, or sorrow, you can be emotionally supportive by affirming those emotions and expressing belief in your spouse. Myra came home from the doctor's office and told her husband, "Mike, the doctor said I might lose the baby. We won't know for another week or so, but it's not looking good. I feel so discouraged. I had hoped that this time everything would go well. I don't know what's wrong with me." She was feeling disappointment, frustration, and sadness, and she was focusing the blame on herself. If Mike wants to be emotionally supportive, he might say, "I can understand why you would feel disappointed. I feel that way too. It's frustrating when we have both tried so hard. When you say, "I don't know what's wrong with me," though, it sounds like you are blaming yourself. I guess if I were in your shoes, I might feel the same way, but I want you to know that is not the way I see it. I think you have done everything right. I think if something happens to this baby, we will have to trust God. I just want you to know that I love you, and I will walk with you through this experience. Let's pray together. Mike is being emotionally supportive of Myra. He is allowing her to have feelings of disappointment and sadness. He is affirming her feelings by saying, if I were in your shoes, I might feel the same way. But he is being honest about his own perspective, and he is assuring her of his support no matter what. That is the kind of emotional support that often makes the difference between success and failure. A fourth way to foster success is by expressing respect for your spouse. Because we are made in the image of God, we are creatures of great value, male and female. Something deep within us affirms that we are creatures of respect and dignity, that God's imprint is upon us. Consequently, demeaning words and behavior make us feel violated. When words and actions affirm our inherent worth, we feel respected. Respect begins with an attitude. I acknowledge that you are a creature of extreme worth. God has endowed you with certain abilities, insights, and spiritual gifts. Therefore, I respect you as a person. I will not desecrate your worth by making critical remarks about your intellect, your judgment, or your logic. I will seek to understand and grant you the freedom to think different from the way I think and to experience emotions that I may not experience. An attitude of respect paves the way for you to show respect for your mate. Respect does not indicate that you agree on everything, but it does mean that you give your spouse the freedom to be an individual. No two humans are alike in the way they think and feel. Respect says, that's an interesting way to look at it, not, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I am often amazed at how inhumanely spouses sometimes treat each other. I remember one man who said to his wife, I can't believe that you are a college graduate and think so illogically. Such degrading statements create animosity, not respect. Allowing your spouse to be who God created him or her to be is the first step toward communicating respect. Trying to argue your spouse into compliance with your own views shows disrespect. To show respect is to look for your mate's God-given giftedness and to affirm and encourage his or her uniqueness. Respect gives people the freedom to be who they are, to think what they think, and to feel what they feel. A wife does not expect her husband to agree with her all the time, but neither does she expect him to call her ideas stupid. A husband knows he is not always right, but he doesn't want to be called a liar. We can express disagreement respectfully. A wife might say to her husband, honey, I don't agree with you, but I know there must be good reasons why you see it that way. When you have time, I would like to hear more of your thoughts on that. A husband might say to his wife, I'm sorry you feel hurt. That was certainly not my intention. Can we talk about it? I met Jonathan in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He came to my seminar alone. At one of the breaks, he said to me, how can I respect my wife when she doesn't live a respectable lifestyle? Lisa has been unfaithful to me at least twice, and I'm not sure what's going on now. I've lost all respect for her. Jonathan raises a very significant question. Not everyone lives a life that is worthy of respect, but we can still respect the inherent worth of the person. Though he couldn't respect Lisa's ungodly lifestyle, he could still respect Lisa, not for what she did but for who she is. Regardless of her behavior, she was made in the image of God and thus is extremely valuable. We must acknowledge that God has given his creatures freedom of choice. Even when people make poor choices, it does not diminish their value as human beings. When Jonathan's wife sinned against him, it brought pain not only to his heart but also to the heart of God for one simple reason. God and Jonathan both love Lisa, and both know that her behavior is detrimental to her and to their relationship with her. However, if Jonathan puts her down by saying, I can't believe you would do this. You're such a scumbag. I hate you, he is not pushing her toward success but toward failure. Lisa is not a scumbag. She is a creature of God for whom Jesus died. She has great potential for good and needs God's redemptive touch. How might Jonathan express respect for his wife in the midst of her failure? He could say, I'm sure you know that your behavior is hurting me deeply. But what really concerns me is that I know your behavior ultimately will hurt you and I care about you. In my mind, you are a wonderful person with great potential, and I want to help you reach that potential. I know you must make your own decisions. I'm not trying to control your life, I'm just telling you how much I value you and how much I love you. Jonathan's respect for Lisa's inherent worth as a human being may well bring her to value herself, and ultimately she may return to God and to Jonathan. If that happens, he will have the joy of forgiving her and cooperating with God in seeing her life redeemed. In his marriage, he will have the pleasure of watching the ice and snow of winter recede as the warming winds of spring begin to take hold. Regardless of what season your marriage is in, when you discover the joy of helping your spouse succeed, you will begin to establish or restore emotional health, respect, support, and encouragement in your marriage. Watching your spouse succeed is one of the great joys of marriage. It is my conviction that marriage is based on the divine principle that two are better than one. In the very beginning, God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." God's answer to Adam's aloneness was the creation of Eve and the institution of marriage. His intention was that the two would become one flesh. This does not mean that in marriage we lose our identity as individuals, but it does mean that we choose to give our lives away for the benefit of the other. When this happens, we both succeed. Together, we accomplish more than either one of us could have accomplished alone. The ultimate purpose of marriage is not sex or happiness or even love. The ultimate purpose of marriage is that a husband and wife will help each other accomplish the purpose for which God created them. When this happens, both spouses experience the ultimate joy of cooperating with God to accomplish His purposes. In the fall season of marriage, our differences begin to be magnified. In the winter season, they stand as icy walls that divide us. For example, when Gerald's marriage was in the fall season, he was mildly irritated by the way Marcy loaded the dishwasher, but when winter took hold, he became livid every time he opened the dishwasher door and saw the chaos. In God's plan, our differences were never intended to divide us. In fact, God is the author of diversity. No two snowflakes, fingerprints, or leaves on a tree are exactly alike. When God created mankind, He built into our genetic structure the potential for unlimited diversity. When He instituted marriage as a union of two unique individuals, He knew that He was creating unity out of diversity. Not only are we different because we're male and female, we're different in every aspect of life. Try taking a walk with your spouse and you'll soon discover that you walk at a different pace and with a different gait. Sit down for a rest and you'll notice that the two of you sit differently. Engage in a conversation and you'll discover that your thoughts are extremely diverse. Set out to accomplish a task such as mowing the grass, vacuuming the carpet, or changing a diaper, and you'll find that each of you has a unique approach. Even our personalities are different. One spouse may be optimistic, whereas the other is pessimistic. One is quiet, the other is talkative. One is logical and methodical, the other is intuitive. One tends to be organized, with everything in its place, the other spends half a lifetime just looking for keys. After years of arguing about differences, each trying to convince the other that his or her way is the best way, couples often conclude that they are incompatible. In fact, incompatibility or irreconcilable differences is often given as the grounds for divorce. After 30 years of counseling married couples, I am convinced there are no irreconcilable differences, only people who refuse to reconcile. In God's mind, our differences are designed to be complementary, not to cause conflicts. This principle is illustrated by the Christian Church, described in 1 Corinthians 12 as being similar to the human body composed of ears, eyes, legs, feet, hands, arms, and so forth. Each member of the church is seen as an important part of the body. When everyone works in unity, each part enhances the others and together they serve the purposes of God. Similarly, in the institution of marriage, God intends for husbands and wives to bring their unique characteristics together to form one team that will work together under God's direction to accomplish His eternal purposes. God designed our differences to be assets, not liabilities. When we learn to maximize our differences for the benefit of the marriage, we align our lives with God's purposes. The Bible calls this marital unity. When each spouse recognizes and affirms the other's uniqueness, the differences themselves weld the couple into an unbeatable team. So how do we tap into this reality in our marriages? How do we maximize our differences in order to move from fall or winter into spring or summer? Identify your differences. The process begins with identifying your differences. If you and your spouse are going to maximize your unique qualities, you need to know the ways in which you're different. This is not a difficult task, but it will require some time and thought. The most obvious differences will be those that are the most irritating. Therefore, One way to identify your differences is to make a list of all the things that irritate you about your spouse. After you've made your list, ask yourself 2 questions. Why do these things irritate me? What differences do these irritations reveal? In most cases, the reason you get irritated is because your spouse doesn't do something the way you would do it. You and your spouse are simply different in these areas, and thus far in your marriage you have seen these differences as irritations. But let's look a little deeper to identify the differences that these irritations reveal. For example, why was Gerald irritated by the way Marcy loaded the dishwasher? Very likely it was because he tends to be organized in his approach to life, whereas Marcy tends to be spontaneous, a common difference observed in many married couples. This difference will show up not only in how they load the dishwasher but in other aspects of life as well. The following list of common differences between husbands and wives may help you identify some of the differences in your own marriage. Talkers often marry people who are quiet and reflective. Early risers often marry those who don't do mornings. People who like to make things happen often marry people who enjoy reading about what happens. Registered people who live by the philosophy, a place for everything and everything in its place, often marry those whose most common question is, where is it? Planners often marry people who want to work out the details as they go along. Copyright homebodies often marry partygoers. People who say, let's be logical, often marry those who say, but it doesn't feel right. Registered penny pinchers often marry spenders, who say, you can't take it with you. 0 avid readers often marry TV addicts. 10 joggers often marry swimmers. 11 channel surfers often marry commercial watchers. 12 and, somehow, country western devotees marry symphony lovers. I am sure you can add to this list, but perhaps it will get you started in identifying your differences. Point 2. Look for assets in your differences. Every difference has a positive side. We don't have to see our differences as irritations. For example, Joe is by nature a couch potato. His wife, Millie, is a butterfly, who is always doing something. She seldom simply sits. In the past, she viewed Joe as lazy, he viewed her as a nervous female who can't relax. They often had words over this difference, but most of the time they simply lived with a low-grade resentment of each other. In my office, Joe said, "Why can't she relax and have fun? Life is short, we don't need to work all the time." Millie responded, "But there is so much that needs to be done. I can't believe he can sit there and watch television and leave everything for me to do." What difference do these irritations reveal? It appears that Joe by nature tends to take a more relaxed and laid-back approach to life, whereas Millie by nature is an activist and tends to be very conscientious. Her theme is, why sit still when you can be doing something productive? Joe's theme is, why work when you can relax? Now that this difference has been identified, let's look for the assets. What is the positive side to Joe's approach to life? He reminds me of the old adage, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. He brings to the table the idea that life is to be enjoyed and that there is to be a balance between work and relaxation.